Rikers Island, New York, November 1952. Bumpy Johnson sat in the cold metal chair, handcuffs biting into his wrists, staring at the federal prosecutor across the table. They had everything. Bank records, witness statements, dates, times, locations of every heroin shipment he'd moved in the last 18 months. But what made Bumpy's blood run cold wasn't the evidence. It was the handwriting on the witness statement. He recognized it immediately. The slanted letters, the way the T's were crossed, the distinctive loop in the capital B. It was the handwriting of the man who'd been by his side for 23 years, the man who'd taken bullets for him, the man he'd called brother. Junie Byrd had sold him out for $5,000. And what happened next would become the most painful chapter in Bumpy Johnson's legendary life. November 1952, and Harlem was changing. The old rules didn't matter anymore. The heroin trade had exploded after World War II, and everyone wanted a piece. The Italians were pushing in from downtown, the police were cracking down harder than ever, and the feds, they weren't interested in small-time numbers runners anymore. They wanted the big fish. They wanted Bumpy Johnson. But Bumpy had survived worse. He'd survived Dutch Schultz. He'd survived Alcatraz. He'd survived negotiations with Lucky Luciano himself. He'd built an empire on loyalty, on trust, on the unbreakable code that said you never, ever turned on your own. That code was about to be shattered by the person he trusted most. Junie Byrd wasn't just Bumpy's friend. He was family. They'd grown up together in South Carolina back in the 1920s, before either of them knew what Harlem even was. Two black kids with nothing but dreams and determination. They'd ridden the rails north together in 1930, sleeping in boxcars, stealing food to survive. When they finally reached New York, they had $17 between them and the clothes on their backs. Bumpy made a promise that night, standing on the corner of 125th Street and Lenox Avenue. Whatever I get, you get. Whatever I build, we build together. Brothers for life. And for 23 years, he'd kept that promise. When Bumpy started working for Stephanie St. Clair, the numbers queen of Harlem, Junie was right there beside him as his lieutenant. When Dutch Schultz tried to muscle into their territory in 1935, Junie was the one who helped plan the resistance. When Bumpy went to Alcatraz in 1951, Junie ran the operation, sent money to Bumpy's wife Mamie every week, kept everything intact. Bumpy trusted him with everything, his business, his secrets, his life. That trust would cost him everything. The trouble started in the summer of 1952. Bumpy had been out of Alcatraz for just over a year, and he was rebuilding. The numbers racket was still profitable, but the real money was in heroin. Bumpy hated the drug trade. He'd seen what it did to communities, how it destroyed families, turned strong men into shadows. But business was business, and if he didn't control it, someone worse would. He kept it regulated, kept it away from kids, kept it as clean as dirty money could be. He brought Junie in as his distribution manager. Junie knew every block captain, every corner, every player in Harlem. He was perfect for the job. But Junie had a problem that Bumpy didn't know about. Gambling. Not the numbers, not the dice games they ran. Horse racing. Junie had developed a taste for betting on horses at Belmont and Aqueduct, and he was terrible at it. By October 1952, Junie was into a loan shark for $12,000. Not one of their loan sharks, an Italian crew out of the Bronx, connected to the Genovese family. They wanted their money, and they didn't care who Junie worked for. The feds had been building a case against Bumpy for months. Agent Robert Wallace of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics had made it his personal mission to take down the so-called mayor of Harlem. But Wallace had a problem. Bumpy was too careful. He never touched the product himself. He never met with suppliers. He never made deals in public. Everything went through intermediaries, and nobody would talk. The code of silence in Harlem was absolute. You didn't cooperate with the feds. You didn't testify against your own. You took your time and kept your mouth shut. Wallace knew he needed someone on the inside, someone close to Bumpy, someone who knew where all the bodies were buried, literally and figuratively. That's when Junie Byrd walked into his office on November 3rd, 1952. Junie didn't want to do it. That's what he told himself anyway. He sat in Wallace's office for 2 hours, hands shaking, sweat running down his face despite the cold November air. Wallace laid it out simply. We know you're Bumpy's right hand. We know you handle distribution. We know you know everything. You give us Bumpy, we give you immunity and $5,000 cash. You don't give us Bumpy, we arrest you right now, and you go down for everything he's done. Plus, we let our Italian friends know exactly where you'll be spending the next 20 years. Junie asked for a cigarette. Wallace slid the pack across the desk. Junie's hands were shaking so badly he could barely light it.
He thought about the 23 years. He thought about the promise Bumpy made on 125th Street. He thought about all the times Bumpy had protected him, elevated him, treated him like blood. Then he thought about $12,000 he owed to men who would kill him slowly. He thought about 20 years in prison. He thought about his own survival. And he made the choice that would haunt him for the rest of his short life. What do you need me to do? Over the next 2 weeks, Junie gave the feds everything: shipment schedules, supplier names, distribution routes, payment records, meeting locations. He wore a wire to 3 separate meetings with Bumpy. He documented transactions. He provided testimony that would be ironclad in
court. And on November 18, 1952, federal agents raided Bumpy's apartment at 3 a.m. Bumpy was arrested, along with 7 members of his organization. The charges were extensive: conspiracy to distribute heroin, racketeering, tax evasion. The evidence was overwhelming, and it all came from one source. When Bumpy sat in that interrogation room and saw Junie's handwriting on the witness statement, something inside him broke. Not his spirit, not his pride, something deeper: his faith in the code he'd built his entire life around. The trial lasted 6 weeks. Junie never appeared in court. The feds kept him in protective custody, afraid that if Harlem found out what he'd done, he'd be dead within hours. But word spreads in tight communities, and by the 3rd week of the trial, everyone knew. Junie Byrd had turned rat. The reaction in Harlem was immediate and brutal. Junie's name became synonymous with betrayal. His family was shunned. His girlfriend left him. People who'd known him for decades crossed the street to avoid being associated with him. Old women spat when they heard his name. He'd violated the most sacred rule. Bumpy was convicted on all charges. The judge sentenced him to 15 years in federal prison. As the marshals let him out of the courtroom, Bumpy's wife Mamie was crying in the gallery. Bumpy didn't look at her. He looked straight ahead, his face carved from stone. But people who were there said they saw something in his eyes they'd never seen before. Not anger, not hatred, sadness. Junie got his $5,000 and his immunity. The feds relocated him to Philadelphia with a new identity. But you can't run from yourself. For the first few months, Junie tried to start over. He got a job at a loading dock. He rented a small apartment in South Philly. He kept his head down, didn't talk to anyone, tried to disappear. But every night when he closed his eyes, he saw Bumpy's face. He heard Bumpy's voice from that night in 1930, brothers for life. He started drinking heavily, cheap whiskey, sometimes a bottle a day. He stopped going to work, stopped paying rent. The landlord found him one morning in February 1953, passed out on the floor, surrounded by empty bottles. He'd tried to drink himself to death, but only succeeded in destroying his liver. They took him to the hospital, pumped his stomach, sent him back to his apartment with a warning. 3 weeks later, he tried again. Back in Harlem, Bumpy was adjusting to prison life, again. This was his 3rd stint behind bars, and he knew the routine. Keep your head down, don't make enemies, do your time. But this time was different. This time, everyone knew how he'd been caught. Even the guards whispered about it. The legendary Bumpy Johnson, brought down by his best friend for $5,000. Not $50,000, not $500,000. 5. That's what 23 years of brotherhood was worth. Bumpy never spoke Junie's name again, not once. When other inmates asked him about it, he'd just shake his head and walk away. But his cellmate later told reporters that sometimes, late at night, he'd hear Bumpy talking in his sleep, the same words over and over. "I trusted you, Junie. I trusted you." Junie lasted 8 months in Philadelphia. On July 12, 1953, a dock worker found his body floating in the Delaware River. The official cause of death was drowning, but the autopsy revealed enough alcohol in his system to kill a horse. The police ruled it a suicide. No note was found, no final words. Just a 39-year-old man who couldn't live with what he'd done. The feds notified Bumpy in prison as a formality. His response was 3 words: "I already knew." When pressed to explain, Bumpy said something that the guard never forgot. "A man who betrays his brother is already dead. He just doesn't know it yet." Junie knew it. That's why he drank. The feds sent Junie's body back to his sister in Harlem for burial. She refused it, said she didn't have a brother named Junie anymore. He was eventually buried in a potter's field in Philadelphia, an unmarked grave with no mourners. Bumpy served 11 years of his 15-year sentence. He was released in 1963, returning to a Harlem that had changed dramatically. The civil rights movement was in full swing.
Drugs had ravaged the community he'd tried to protect. Old faces were gone, new players had taken over. But the story of Junie Byrd's betrayal lived on. It became a cautionary tale told in barbershops and pool halls. Old-timers would tell young kids, "You see what happened to Junie? That's what happens when you break the code. Not the law, the code." Bumpy himself never publicly discussed it, but those close to him said the betrayal changed him fundamentally. He trusted less. He kept people at a distance. The man who'd once believed in brotherhood above all else had learned the hardest lesson. Everyone has a price. For Junie Byrd, that price was $5,000 and the destruction of his soul. The saddest part, the $5,000 Junie received was gone within a month. He'd paid off $4,000 to the loan sharks, spent the rest on his relocation and drinking. In the end, he'd traded 23 years of friendship, his reputation, his family, his community, and ultimately his life for a temporary solution to a temporary problem. Bumpy once told a journalist years later, in one of the rare moments he reflected on it, "Junie didn't betray me for money. He betrayed me because he was scared. And I understand that. Fear makes people do things they never thought they could do. But understanding it doesn't make it hurt less. It doesn't bring back what was lost." If this story of betrayal, consequences, and the price of breaking the code moved you, hit that subscribe button and drop a like. Share this with someone who needs to understand that loyalty isn't just a word, it's a way of life. And let me know in the comments, could you ever forgive a betrayal like this?
Your circle tight, your word solid, and I'll see you in the next one.